The chisel struck limestone, and the sound echoed through the Valley of the Kings like a whisper from eternity itself. November 26, 1922. Howard Carter's hands trembled as fragments of ancient plaster crumbled beneath his tools, revealing a darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 3,000 years. Behind him, Lord Carnarvon leaned forward, his breathing shallow with anticipation. The workmen had fallen silent, their shadows dancing against the tomb walls in the flickering candlelight, as if the very spirits of the ancients were watching, waiting. Carter widened the opening just enough to slip a candle through. The flame guttered in air that had been sealed since the time of the pharaohs, threatening to extinguish entirely before steadying into a golden glow. What he saw in that moment would change archaeology forever. His patron could barely contain himself, demanding to know what Carter could see through that impossibly small opening. The answer came in 3 words that would echo through history. Wonderful things. And wonderful they were. The candlelight caught the edge of a golden couch, its posts carved into the shapes of sacred animals whose eyes seemed to gleam with their own internal light. Everywhere Carter looked, the shadows revealed treasures beyond imagination. Gilded statues standing sentinel in the darkness, ornate chests inlaid with ivory and precious stones, chariots overlaid with gold leaf that still gleamed despite millennia of darkness. It was a glimpse into a world that had existed before Rome, before Greece, a civilization so advanced and mysterious that even in death, its kings commanded the labor of thousands and the wealth of nations. But something else waited in that tomb, something that no amount of gold could outweigh. According to numerous accounts, though disputed by some scholars, a clay tablet rested near the entrance, its hieroglyphic inscription carrying a message across the ages. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. Some say Carter himself ordered the tablet hidden away, recognizing the panic such a warning might cause among his superstitious workers. Others claim the tablet never existed at all, that it was invented later by journalists hungry for a more dramatic story. But whether carved in clay or merely whispered in the darkness of the tomb, the Curse of Tutankhamun was about to become terrifyingly real. Within 7 years of that fateful November day, the pattern of death began to emerge like hieroglyphics, slowly coming into focus under careful examination. These were not the deaths of elderly men who had lived full lives. These were sudden, inexplicable, often bizarre endings that seemed to defy medical explanation. The men who had stood in that tomb, who had breathed its ancient air and laid hands upon objects meant to accompany a god-king into eternity, began to fall one by one. 6 deaths in particular would capture the world's imagination and cement the legend of the mummy's curse in popular consciousness. Each death carried its own disturbing details, its own unsettling coincidences that seemed to point towards something beyond mere chance. The pattern was undeniable to those who believed. Proximity to the tomb, to its treasures, to the mummy itself, appeared to carry a terrible price. The shadow of the curse stretched far beyond the Valley of the Kings, touching lives in London, in Paris, in Cairo. It seemed to make no distinction between those who had entered the burial chamber itself and those who had merely examined its contents afterward. The curse, if curse it was, appeared to have a long memory and an even longer reach. Skeptics would argue for coincidence, for the statistical probability of death among any group of people over a span of years. But the believers pointed to the specifics, the strange circumstances, the eerie timing that seemed orchestrated by an intelligence that transcended the grave. What makes us believe in curses? Perhaps it is the recognition that some boundaries should not be crossed, that certain sacred spaces demand respect rather than violation. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transformation, and that the proper rituals and protections were essential for the deceased to complete their journey to the afterlife. To disturb a tomb was not merely theft, it was an assault on eternity itself, a disruption of cosmic order that would demand cosmic retribution. Or perhaps we create curses to make sense of randomness, to find pattern in chaos. The human mind rebels against meaningless tragedy, seeking instead a narrative that explains why certain people suffer while others escape unscathed. A curse provides that narrative, transforming random misfortune into a story with clear cause and effect, with transgression and punishment, with a kind of terrible justice at its heart. The deaths that followed the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb would test both explanations, challenging skeptic and believer alike to account for coincidences too numerous to ignore, yet too bizarre to accept at face value. In the chapters that follow, we will examine each death in detail, weighing the evidence, exploring the medical facts, and confronting the unsettling questions that remain unanswered to this day. The curse of King Tut has endured for a century, not because we have proven it real, but because we have failed to prove it impossible. The mosquito was tiny, insignificant, barely worth noticing in the warm Egyptian evening. It landed on Lord Carnarvon's left cheek while he performed his morning shave on a day in late March of 1923, just weeks after he had stood inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber as one of the first people in over 3,000 years to gaze upon the pharaoh's treasure. The razor nicked the insect bite, opening a small wound that would, in the end, prove far deadlier than any ancient curse carved in hieroglyphs. George Edward Stanhope, Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had financed Howard Carter's excavations in the Valley of the Kings for nearly 16 years. He had poured enormous sums of money into what many considered a fool's errand, season after season of disappointing results in the harsh Egyptian desert. But in November of 1922, his patience was finally rewarded with the discovery of the century. He had entered the tomb on November 26th, standing beside Carter as they first glimpsed the antechamber packed with golden treasures. He had been there when they breached the sealed doorway to the burial chamber itself on February 17th of 1923. He had seen wonders that made him one of the most envied men in the world. Now, just 6 weeks later, that tiny cut on his cheek began to fester. At first it seemed like nothing more than an irritation. Lord Carnarvon mentioned it casually to his daughter Evelyn, who had accompanied him to Egypt. The area around the bite became inflamed, slightly swollen, tender to the touch. In the heat and dust of the archaeological site, such minor infections were common enough. But this wound refused to heal. Instead, it grew angrier, more painful, the redness spreading across his aristocratic cheek like a stain. By early April, Lord Carnarvon was confined to his rooms at the Continental Hotel in Cairo, one of the city's most luxurious establishments, where wealthy Europeans gathered to experience Egypt in comfort and style. The Continental sat in the heart of the city, a grand building that represented British colonial elegance transported to African soil. Its high ceilings, slowly rotating fans, and attentive staff usually provided relief from the Egyptian heat. But for Lord Carnarvon there would be no relief. The infection in his cheek had entered his bloodstream. What doctors would clinically describe as blood poisoning or septicemia began its relentless work through his body. His temperature climbed steadily upward, and with the fever came delirium. Evelyn sat beside her father's bed, watching helplessly as one of the most powerful and wealthy men in England deteriorated before her eyes. She dabbed his forehead with cool cloths, whispered reassurances, and sent urgent telegrams to England, requesting that her brother and stepmother make the journey to Egypt immediately. Lord Carnarvon drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered mind carrying him to places his daughter could not follow. When he spoke, his words often made little sense, disconnected fragments about the tomb, about golden faces, about shadows moving in lamplight. The doctors, trained in the best European medical schools, shook their heads grimly. Blood poisoning was a serious condition in 1923, before the discovery of antibiotics. Once an infection entered the bloodstream, there was precious little medicine could do except wait and hope the body's own defenses proved strong enough to fight back. But Lord Carnarvon's body, weakened by years of poor health following a serious automobile accident in his youth, was not strong enough. The 56-year-old Earl had never fully recovered from that crash in 1901, which had left him with chronic breathing problems and a general fragility that the harsh Egyptian climate only exacerbated. Now, as the infection raged through his system, his weakened constitution could mount no effective defense. On the night of April 4th, as Cairo settled into darkness beyond the hotel windows, Lord Carnarvon appeared to rally slightly. He opened his eyes with unusual clarity and looked at his daughter with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Then he spoke words that would be repeated and analyzed for decades to come, words that seemed to confirm the darkest fears about what they had disturbed in the Valley of the Kings. "I have heard the call," he whispered to Evelyn, his voice barely audible above the sound of the electric fans circling overhead. "I am following." What call? Following where? Evelyn leaned closer, but her father's eyes had already closed again. His breathing became labored, rattling in his damaged lungs. The doctors moved around the bed with increased urgency, but there was nothing they could do. Modern medical science, for all its advances, could not stop what had been set in motion by that mosquito bite on his cheek. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, on April 5, 1923, Lord Carnarvon drew his final breath and died in room number 14 of Cairo's Continental Hotel. His daughter held his hand. The doctors noted the time, and according to accounts that emerged immediately afterward, at that exact moment, every electric light in Cairo suddenly went out. The blackout plunged the entire city into darkness. From the Continental Hotel to the most distant neighborhoods, the electrical supply simply failed without warning or explanation. Cairo sat in absolute darkness for several minutes while Lord Carnarvon's body cooled in his hotel room. Then, just as mysteriously as they had failed, the lights flickered back to life. Utility workers and electrical engineers could offer no explanation for the outage. The system had simply stopped working, then started again, as if the city itself had paused to mark the Earl's passing. But the strangeness did not end with the lights. Thousands of miles away in England, at Highclere Castle, the Carnarvon family's ancestral estate in Hampshire, Lord Carnarvon's favorite dog began to howl at approximately the same time its master died in Cairo. The dog, which had remained at the castle while the family traveled to Egypt, suddenly lifted its head and released a long, mournful cry that woke the household staff. It howled as if in terrible pain or grief, though nothing was physically wrong with the animal. The servants rushed to the dog, trying to calm it, but before they could even reach it, the animal collapsed and died. Only later, when the telegram arrived from Egypt announcing Lord Carnarvon's death, did the staff realize that the dog had died at precisely the moment its master passed away, despite the vast distance separating them. The simultaneous deaths became immediate fodder for those who believed that Lord Carnarvon had fallen victim to supernatural forces unleashed by the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. The medical explanation was straightforward and tragic. Lord Carnarvon had died of blood poisoning resulting from an infected mosquito bite, his death hastened by his already weakened constitution, and the lack of antibiotic treatments that would not become available for another 2 decades. In an era when even minor infections could turn deadly, his death, while certainly unfortunate, was not medically unusual. Hundreds of people died from similar causes every year across the world. But Lord Carnarvon was not just anyone. He was the wealthy financier, the most spectacular archaeological discovery in modern history. He had stood in Tutankhamun's tomb, had gazed upon the pharaoh's treasures, had been present when seals unbroken for 3,000 years were finally opened. And now, just 4 months after that momentous entry into the burial chamber, he was dead under circumstances that seemed almost too dramatically timed to be mere coincidence. The newspapers seized upon the story with gleeful abandon. Lord Carnarvon became the first and most prominent victim of what the press immediately dubbed the Curse of the Pharaohs. His death launched a media frenzy that would last for years, as journalists cataloged every subsequent death connected, however tenuously, to the tomb's discovery. The fact that he was an earl, wealthy and titled, made the story even more compelling. Here was proof, the papers suggested, that ancient Egyptian magic could reach across millennia to strike down even the most powerful modern men. The detail about the lights failing across Cairo became a cornerstone of curse mythology, repeated in countless articles and books. Some versions claimed the blackout lasted only seconds. Others insisted it went on for hours. Some reports said only the neighborhood around the Continental Hotel lost power. Others maintained the entire city went dark. The truth became less important than the story's symbolic power. The lights going out at the moment of death suggested supernatural forces at work, reality itself responding to the passing of someone who had dared disturb an ancient tomb. The death of the dog at Highclere Castle provided another layer of eerie coincidence. How could a dog in England know the exact moment its master died in Egypt? The bond between Lord Carnarvon and his pet became proof of psychic connections, of souls calling across impossible distances, of forces that science could not explain or measure. Skeptics pointed out that no one had actually checked what time the dog died until after news of Lord Carnarvon's death arrived, that human memory is notoriously unreliable. that the timing might not have been as precise as claimed. But by then, the story had taken on a life of its own. Lord Carnarvon's body was embalmed and transported back to England for burial at Highclere Castle. His death transformed him from a wealthy amateur Egyptologist into a cautionary tale, the man who had paid the ultimate price for disturbing the dead. His name became forever linked with Tutankhamun's, but not in the way he might have hoped. Instead of being remembered primarily as the visionary financier who made the discovery possible, he became the curse's first victim, the man whose mosquito bite proved that ancient Egypt still had power in the modern world. The tablet was never supposed to disappear. In the winter of 1922, when Howard Carter first descended into the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, he stood face to face with 3,000 years of undisturbed silence. The air was thick with dust particles that danced in the beam of his electric torch, each mote a fragment of history suspended in time. Among the treasures that first greeted his eyes, Carter later claimed there was something else, something he mentioned only in passing to a journalist from London. A clay tablet, roughly the size of a man's palm, pressed with hieroglyphic warnings that promised death to any who violated the pharaoh's eternal rest. The problem is, no photograph exists of this tablet. No sketch appears in the meticulous records that Carter maintained throughout the excavation. No mention surfaces in the official catalogs of artifacts that were painstakingly numbered, measured, and documented. The curse tablet, if it ever existed, vanished as completely as morning mist under the Egyptian sun. Yet, the rumor of its existence spread through the archaeological community and beyond, becoming perhaps more powerful in absence than it ever could have been as a physical object sitting in a museum display case. What makes this disappearance so tantalizing is that Carter himself was the source of the story. According to reports that circulated in newspapers at the time, he told several people about finding the tablet near the entrance to the burial chamber. The inscription allegedly read something along the lines of "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." These words, or variations of them, appeared in dozens of newspaper accounts. They became the foundation upon which the entire curse of King Tut was built, the spark that ignited a firestorm of supernatural speculation. But why would Carter, a man of science and careful documentation, mention such an explosive find and then allow it to disappear without trace? Several theories emerge, each more intriguing than the last. Perhaps he recognized immediately that such a tablet would fuel exactly the kind of sensationalism he claimed to despise, turning his greatest archaeological achievement into a carnival of superstition. Perhaps his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who died mere months after the tomb's opening, made him promise to suppress evidence of curses to avoid frightening away workers or investors. Perhaps Carter simply fabricated the story in a moment of theatrical enthusiasm, never imagining it would take on a life of its own. Or perhaps, most unsettlingly, the tablet was real, and someone made a deliberate decision that the world should never see it. To understand what Carter might have found, we must first understand what ancient Egyptians actually inscribed in their tombs. The walls of New Kingdom burial chambers were covered with protective spells, drawn from collections of funerary texts that evolved over centuries. The most famous of these is the Book of the Dead, though this name is a Victorian invention. The ancient Egyptians knew it as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a guidebook for navigating the treacherous journey through the underworld. These texts were not curses in the vengeful sense we imagine today. They were protective spells, carefully crafted by priests to shield the deceased from the dangers that lurked in the realm of Osiris. Demons with knives, lakes of fire, serpents that could consume a soul. The inscriptions gave the dead person magical knowledge, secret names of gatekeepers, passwords to pass through each of the 12 hours of night. They were maps written in hieroglyphics, each symbol a key to survival in a landscape more dangerous than any living person could imagine. But there was another category of inscription, less common but more relevant to our mystery. These were the protective warnings, the threats directed not at supernatural entities, but at very real human tomb robbers. The tomb of Kantika at Saqqara, dating to the Old Kingdom, contains such a warning. It promises that anyone who enters the tomb with evil intent will be judged by the great god, will be seized by a crocodile in the water and a snake on land. The tomb of Harkuf at Aswan threatens that the spirit of the dead man will wring the neck of any violator like a goose. These were not empty threats to ancient Egyptian minds. The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was far more permeable in their cosmology than in ours. A written curse, properly inscribed and activated through ritual, was believed to possess genuine power. The hieroglyphic script itself was considered magical. Each symbol was not merely a representation of a sound or concept, but a living entity that could be brought to life through the act of carving it into stone. Priests underwent years of training in the houses of life, temple workshops where sacred texts were copied and magical knowledge was preserved. These men genuinely believed in the effectiveness of their spells. To them, writing a protective curse on a tomb entrance was no different than installing a lock on a door. Both were practical security measures, one operating on the physical plane and one on the spiritual. Consider the care with which certain hieroglyphs were modified in tomb inscriptions. Symbols representing dangerous animals like snakes or scorpions were sometimes carved incomplete, missing their tails or stingers, to prevent them from coming to life and harming the deceased. If priests took such precautions with decorative elements, imagine the power they invested in actual curse texts, written with the explicit intention of channeling supernatural force against intruders. Yet skepticism must temper our understanding. The ancient Egyptians were also pragmatists. Tomb robbery was endemic throughout pharaonic history, a constant economic reality driven by the immense wealth buried with the elite. Did priests truly believe their curses would stop determined thieves? Or were the warnings primarily psychological deterrents, playing on the superstitions of potential robbers who might be literate enough to read the inscription? Evidence exists for both interpretations. On one hand, we have the elaborate magical precautions, the time and resources invested in protective spells, suggesting genuine belief. On the other hand, we have the archaeological record itself. Nearly every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, despite whatever curses may have protected them. The only reason Tutankhamun's tomb survived relatively intact was accident of geology and timing, buried beneath debris from later tomb construction and forgotten. This brings us back to Carter's mysterious tablet. If it existed, what might it have said? The formula he reported about death on swift wings doesn't match the style of known protective inscription. Most genuine tomb curses are more specific, invoking particular gods or describing precise punishments. They identify the deceased by name and titles. They often contain clauses distinguishing between those who enter with pure intentions versus those with evil intent, suggesting that ancient tomb designers understood the difference between legitimate priests performing maintenance and thieves seeking gold. Some researchers have suggested that Carter may have encountered not a curse tablet, but a foundation deposit, a common feature of Egyptian tombs. These were ritual objects buried at key points during construction, often containing inscribed plaques, identifying the tomb owner and invoking divine protection. Such plaques typically bore standard formulae, combinations of hieroglyphs that appeared in hundreds of tombs across centuries. Nothing unique, nothing newsworthy, nothing that would spark headlines. But perhaps that was exactly the problem. Perhaps Carter, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his discovery, embellished a mundane foundation plaque into something more dramatic when speaking to journalists. Then, when colleagues began demanding to see this sensational artifact, he realized his exaggeration had gotten away from him. The easiest solution would be to quietly let it disappear from the record, to claim it must have been misfiled or lost in the chaos of the excavation. This theory paints Carter as human, fallible, caught in a moment of enthusiasm that he later regretted. It's compelling precisely because it's so ordinary, so understandable. We've all exaggerated a story in the moment, then squirmed when asked to provide proof. Yet, there's another possibility, darker and more intriguing. What if Carter did find a curse tablet, one with inscriptions so unusual or disturbing that he made a calculated decision to suppress it? By 1922, Egyptology was fighting for legitimacy as a scientific discipline. Explorers like Carter were trying to distinguish themselves from the treasure hunters and colonial plunderers of earlier generations. A genuine curse tablet, especially one that could be sensationalized in the press, threatened to undermine decades of work establishing archaeology as serious scholarship rather than supernatural adventure. When Lord Carnarvon died in April of 1923, barely 5 months after the tomb's opening, the curse story exploded beyond anyone's control. Newspapers around the world ran headlines about ancient vengeance reaching across millennia. The fact that Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite, a tragically common occurrence in Egypt at the time, didn't matter to a public hungry for mystery. Every subsequent death connected even tangentially to the excavation was added to a supposed curse toll. If Carter had been sitting on evidence of an actual curse tablet during this media frenzy, can you imagine the pressure he must have felt? To produce it would vindicate the sensationalists and mock his own scientific credibility. To continue hiding it would make him complicit in suppressing evidence. Either choice was impossible. The question that haunts this mystery is not whether ancient Egyptian curses worked, but whether Carter believed they might. He spent decades working in Egypt, immersed in a culture where the boundary between past and present felt permeable. He watched the sun set behind the Theban hills exactly as it had when Tutankhamun was alive. He read the same spells by lamplight that priests had chanted 3,000 years earlier. It's hard to imagine that such immersion didn't affect his worldview, didn't open him to possibilities that his rational scientific training told him to reject. In the end, the curse tablet's greatest power may be its absence. As long as it remains missing, it exists in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously real and imaginary. Every researcher who examines the Tutankhamun records looks for it, hoping to be the one who finally solves the mystery. Was it ever there at all? The evidence is maddeningly ambiguous, a perfect unsolved puzzle that tells us as much about our hunger for mystery as it does about ancient Egypt. The ancient tomb had been silent for over 3,000 years when the X-ray machine arrived at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in early 1923. The boxy apparatus, with its glass vacuum tubes and crackling electrical components, represented the cutting edge of modern medical technology. It had been brought specifically to peer beneath the wrappings of the boy King Tutankhamun, to see what secrets lay hidden within the bandaged remains without disturbing the mummy itself. The man chosen to operate this machine was Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, one of the most respected radiologists in the British Empire, a man whose expertise with X-rays had saved countless lives and advanced medical science in ways previously unimaginable. Reed arrived in Cairo on a warm February morning, full of energy and enthusiasm for the task ahead. Colleagues who met him at the museum later recalled how vigorous he seemed, how his eyes lit up when discussing the unprecedented opportunity to examine such an ancient specimen using modern technology. He was 54 years old, robust and healthy, with no history of serious illness. His hands were steady as he supervised the careful positioning of the equipment around the sarcophagus. This was to be a historic moment, the intersection of ancient Egypt and 20th century science, and Reed understood the weight of what he was about to do. The X-ray session took place in a sealed chamber within the museum, away from the public galleries. The mummy of Tutankhamun lay on a preparation table, still wrapped in the linen bandages that had enclosed it for millennia. The air in the room was thick and stale, carrying the peculiar musty odor that clings to things that have existed in darkness for epochs beyond human reckoning. Reed worked methodically, adjusting the angles of the X-ray tube, checking the photographic plates that would capture the images, ensuring every detail was perfect. He wore no protective gear, as was common for the period. The dangers of radiation exposure were only beginning to be understood, and most radiologists of the era worked with bare hands, their skin directly exposed to the invisible rays. The machine hummed to life with an electric whine that filled the chamber. Reed leaned close to the mummy, his face mere inches from the ancient wrappings as he made final adjustments. The session lasted several hours, during which Reed took multiple exposures from different angles, repositioning the heavy mummy with his own hands when necessary. He touched the bandages, felt the hardness of the preserved flesh beneath, breathed the air that seemed to carry dust from the tomb itself. When the work was finally complete, he seemed satisfied but noticeably drained, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool temperature of the stone chamber. That evening, Reed joined colleagues for dinner at their hotel. Those present would later recall that something had changed in him. The vibrant energy of the morning had vanished, replaced by an unsettling lethargy. He barely touched his food, complaining of a headache and unusual fatigue. When asked if he was feeling well, Reed dismissed their concerns with a weak smile, attributing his exhaustion to the long journey and the intensity of the day's work. but his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his water glass, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that troubled those who knew him well. By the following morning, Reed's condition had deteriorated dramatically. He could barely rise from his bed, overcome by a profound weakness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. His colleague, Dr. James Harrison, who checked on him around 9 o'clock, found Reed drenched in sweat, his breathing shallow and labored. Reed described feeling as though all the strength had been drained from his body, as if something vital had been pulled from him during the night. He spoke of strange dreams, of darkness closing in, of ancient whispers in a language he could not comprehend. Harrison, alarmed, immediately sent for a local physician. The doctor who examined Reed that morning could find nothing specifically wrong. His temperature was slightly elevated, but not dangerously so. His pulse was weak, but regular. There were no visible signs of infection, no obvious injuries, nothing that would explain the profound, systemic collapse that was clearly overtaking him. The physician prescribed rest and fluids, assuring Harrison that Reed was likely suffering from a combination of exhaustion and perhaps a mild tropical fever. In 1923, Cairo, such ailments were common among Europeans unaccustomed to the climate. There seemed no reason for serious alarm. But Reed continued to decline with terrifying rapidity. By that afternoon, he had become delirious, muttering about shadows moving in the X-ray chamber, about cold fingers touching his neck as he worked. He claimed he could still smell the mummy, that the odor had gotten inside him somehow, that it was spreading through his blood. His colleagues gathered anxiously in the hotel corridor, exchanged worried glances. This was not mere exhaustion or a simple fever. Something profoundly wrong was happening to a man who had been in perfect health just 24 hours earlier. The second night brought no improvement. Reed's breathing became increasingly difficult, as though his lungs were forgetting how to draw air. His skin took on a strange, almost waxy quality that reminded those attending him of the very mummy he had x-rayed. Nurses brought in to care for him whispered among themselves about the unnatural speed of his decline, how it seemed as though he was aging before their eyes, his vitality being consumed by some invisible force. One nurse, a local woman named Fatima, who had worked in Cairo hospitals for years, refused to enter his room after midnight, claiming she had seen a shadow standing over his bed, a shadow in the shape of a man wearing the crown of ancient Egypt. By the morning of the third day, 48 hours after he had touched the mummy of Tutankhamun, Sir Archibald Douglas Reed was dead. The official cause of death was listed as circulatory collapse, but this was more a description than an explanation. His heart had simply stopped. His organs had ceased functioning, as though a switch had been thrown, turning off the machinery of life. Physicians who examined his body could offer no satisfactory medical explanation for why a healthy middle-aged man would experience such rapid and total system failure. There were no toxins in his blood, no signs of infectious disease, no evidence of heart disease or stroke. He had simply, inexplicably died. The news spread quickly through the archaeological and medical communities, and almost immediately, the whispers began. Reed's death came less than 2 months after the death of Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of Howard Carter's expedition, who had died mysteriously after entering Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, a second man closely associated with the boy king's mummy had died under equally mysterious circumstances. The coincidence seemed too striking to ignore, and the legend of the pharaoh's curse, which had already begun to take root in the public imagination, grew stronger and more detailed. Some suggested that Reed had been poisoned by toxic mold or bacteria that had accumulated in the mummy's wrappings over millennia. Ancient organic materials, sealed in tombs for thousands of years, could indeed harbor dangerous fungal spores or bacterial colonies that might prove fatal to anyone breathing them in concentrated doses. Reed had spent hours in close proximity to the mummy, his face near the bandages, breathing deeply in the confined space of the examination chamber. Could some ancient pathogen, preserved in the dry Egyptian climate, have found a new host in the radiologist's lungs? Others pointed to the radiation itself. In 1923, the long-term effects of X-ray exposure were not fully understood, but cases of radiation sickness were beginning to be documented among those who worked extensively with the technology. Could Reed have somehow given himself a massive, lethal dose during the examination? But radiation sickness typically manifested over days or weeks, not hours. and the symptoms Reed experienced did not quite match the known effects of radiation exposure. His death was too sudden, too complete, too much like something had simply switched him off. The more superstitious observers, particularly among the local Egyptian population, had no doubt about what had killed Douglas Reed. He had violated the sanctity of the pharaoh's remains, had subjected the sacred body to the profane scrutiny of modern machines, and the ancient gods had exacted their price. The curse inscribed in tombs throughout the Valley of the Kings promised death to any who disturbed the rest of the deceased, and Reed's fate seemed to fulfill that dark prophecy with chilling precision. The fact that he had touched the mummy with his bare hands, that he had positioned it and moved it without the proper reverence, made his transgression all the more severe in the eyes of those who believed in such things. What makes Reed's death particularly unsettling is the testimony of those who knew him best. These were not superstitious laypeople, but educated medical professionals who had worked alongside him for years. To a person, they described him as being in excellent health before the X-ray session, physically robust and mentally sharp. The transformation they witnessed over those final 48 hours defied their medical training and experience. Dr. Harrison, who had known Reed for over a decade, would later write in his private journal that watching his colleague die was like watching a man be consumed from within, as though some invisible force was steadily draining the life from him drop by drop. The X-ray plates Reed produced during his final session were developed after his death. They showed the skeleton of the young pharaoh in remarkable detail, revealing fractures and abnormalities that would later help archaeologists understand Tutankhamun's short life and untimely death. But some who examined those plates claimed to see other things as well: shadow forms that should not have been present, strange halos of light around the mummy's head, and hands that could not be explained by the technology of the time. One researcher insisted he could see a face emerging from the static on one plate, a stern visage that seemed to stare directly out at the viewer with eyes that held 3,000 years of darkness. Whether Sir Archibald Douglas Reed died from natural causes, environmental toxins, radiation exposure, or something that exists beyond the boundaries of rational explanation may never be known with certainty. What remains undeniable is that a healthy man in his prime touched the mummy of Tutankhamun and was dead within 2 days, his death unexplained and unexplainable by the medical science of his time. His case became one of the central pillars supporting the legend of the pharaoh's curse, a legend that continues to fascinate and disturb us a century later. In the intersection of ancient mystery and modern science, in that sealed chamber where cutting-edge technology met remains that predated the Roman Empire, something happened that medicine could not explain and that reason struggles to comprehend. And sometimes, in the quiet hours, we must confront the possibility that there are forces in this world older and darker than our understanding can encompass. The morning of January the 7th, 1924, arrived cold and gray over the Valley of the Kings. Joel Wolfe stood at the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb, his breath misting in the desert air that still held the chill of the Egyptian winter. As a successful British industrialist and a close friend of Lord Carnarvon, Wolfe had received what many considered a privilege beyond measure. He would be among the select few allowed to descend into the burial chamber itself, to stand in the presence of the boy king, to witness what Howard Carter had called the most spectacular archaeological discovery of the age. Wolfe was not an easily impressed man. His fortune had been built on steel mills and shipping contracts, on hard negotiations and harder decisions. He approached the world with the practical skepticism of someone who dealt in tonnage and profit margins. Yet, as he made his way down the descending corridor, past the sealed doorways that had been breached, past the antechamber with its jumbled treasures, he felt something he had not anticipated. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing against his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the confined space. According to his own journal entries, discovered years later, Wolfe wrote that the burial chamber possessed an atmosphere unlike anything he had encountered. The golden walls seemed to absorb the electric lights Carter's team had installed, creating shadows that shifted and moved in ways that defied the static positioning of the bulbs. The great quartzite sarcophagus dominated the room, and within it, nested like secrets within secrets, lay the golden coffins that held the mummy of Tutankhamun himself. Wolfe spent nearly 40 minutes in the burial chamber that day. Carter himself served as guide, pointing out the intricate details of the wall paintings, explaining the significance of the protective goddesses, who spread their wings across the corners of the shrine. But Wolf found himself distracted, unable to focus on Carter's scholarly explanations. He became acutely aware of a sensation he struggled to articulate. In his journal, he described it as the feeling of being observed, not by his living companions, but by something else, something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. The dizziness began subtly. At first, Wolf attributed it to the stale air, the heat of the electric lights, perhaps the natural reaction of standing in such a confined space surrounded by such overwhelming antiquity. But the sensation intensified. The golden walls seemed to tilt, the hieroglyphics to swim before his eyes. He reached out to steady himself against the shrine, and one of Carter's assistants noticed his pallor, the way sweat had broken out across his forehead despite the coolness of the underground chamber. They helped him back to the surface. Wolf sat in the shade of the expedition tent, drinking water, insisting he was fine, that it was merely a passing spell. But he confided to Carter something that the archaeologist later shared with colleagues. Wolf said that in those final moments before the dizziness overwhelmed him, he had felt a distinct pressure against the back of his neck, as though someone had placed their hand there. When he turned, no one stood behind him. The nearest person had been Carter himself, several feet away, facing the opposite wall. Wolf returned to London in late January, putting the strange experience behind him with the same practicality he applied to business matters. He told friends about the wonders of the tomb, the gold, the exquisite craftsmanship, but he rarely mentioned the dizziness or the sensation of being watched. When he did speak of it, usually after several glasses of port, he would laugh it off as the product of excitement and poor ventilation, nothing more. By April of 1924, Wolf checked into a private London hospital for what his doctors described as a routine procedure. The exact nature of the surgery remains unclear in medical records, but contemporary accounts suggest it involved the removal of a benign growth, something entirely ordinary, with an expected recovery time of perhaps a week. The surgery went smoothly. Wolf woke in his private room, groggy but in good spirits, joking with nurses about being back at his desk within days. The hospital sat in Bloomsbury, one of those imposing Victorian buildings that seemed designed to inspire confidence through sheer architectural weight. Wolf's room occupied the third floor, overlooking a street perpetually shrouded in the coal smoke and fog that characterized London in that era. The evening after his surgery, a thick fog rolled in, pressing against the windows like a living thing, reducing the gaslights outside to dim, hazy orbs floating in the gray. The night nurse, a woman named Margaret Blackwell, whose testimony was recorded in hospital incident reports, described her rounds that evening. She checked on Wolf at 10 o'clock and found him sleeping peacefully. The room felt normal, she said, nothing out of the ordinary. When she returned at midnight, she noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. She could see her breath, despite the steam radiator hissing in the corner. Wolf was still asleep, but restless now, muttering words she could not quite make out. Blackwell added coal to the radiator and adjusted Wolf's blankets. As she turned to leave, she noticed what she later described as a shadow in the corner of the room, near the window. Not the normal shadow cast by furniture or the dim lamp that burned on the bedside table, but a shadow that seemed to possess depth, dimension, a darkness that stood independent of any light source. She blinked, and it was gone. She convinced herself it had been a trick of the fog outside, the way the limited light played against the window glass. At 2 in the morning, another nurse making rounds heard a heavy thud from Wolf's room. She rushed in to find him on the floor beside his bed, his body positioned in a way that struck her as strange. He had not simply rolled from the bed. He lay several feet away, as though he had been pulled or had scrambled in an attempt to escape something. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. The duty doctor was summoned immediately. What he found troubled him deeply, enough that he made detailed notes that survived in the hospital's archive. Wolf had sustained a serious head injury from the fall, but that was not what captured the doctor's attention. Across Wolf's arms and shoulders, dark bruises had begun to form, vivid against his pale skin. The pattern of the bruising made no sense. These were not the kind of marks one would expect from a fall. They appeared in clusters, in shapes that the doctor's notes describe as resembling fingerprints, as though someone had gripped Wolf's arms with tremendous force. Moreover, there were marks on the back of Wolf's neck, 5 distinct impressions that could only be described as finger-shaped. The doctor documented them carefully, noting their placement, their depth, their complete incompatibility with a simple fall from a hospital bed. Who could have made such marks? The room had been locked from the inside, the door handle undisturbed when the nurse entered. The window remained firmly closed, the fog pressing against it from the outside. Wolf never regained consciousness. He died at dawn, as the fog began to lift and the gray London morning revealed itself. The official cause of death was listed as head trauma resulting from an accidental fall, complicated by post-surgical weakness. But the doctor who examined him refused to sign off on that conclusion without adding a detailed addendum describing the unexplained bruising, the marks on the neck, the peculiar positioning of the body. Nurse Blackwell, interviewed by hospital administrators, reluctantly shared what she had seen the night before. Not just the shadow in the corner, but something else she had initially kept to herself, fearing it would sound mad. When she had checked on Wolf at midnight, when she had seen that impossible shadow, she had also heard something. A whisper, soft but distinct, coming from no identifiable source. She could not make out words, but the tone was clear. It sounded, she said, like a warning, or perhaps a summons. Other nurses came forward after Wolf's death, sharing their own experiences from that night. One reported that all the lights in the third-floor corridor had flickered at precisely 2 a.m, the moment Wolf fell. Another mentioned seeing a patient's water glass in the room next to Wolf's shatter spontaneously, with no one near it. A third nurse, who had been stationed at the floor's main desk, swore she had seen a figure moving past Wolf's door in the moments before the fall. A silhouette that seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving with a gliding motion that did not match normal human gait. The hospital, anxious to avoid scandal, conducted a brief internal investigation that concluded nothing unusual had occurred. Wolf had been weakened by surgery, had perhaps suffered a moment of confusion or a reaction to medication, had fallen from his bed and struck his head. The bruising, while unusual, could perhaps be explained by the fall itself, by the body striking the bed frame or the floor in unexpected ways. The marks on his neck were attributed to post-mortem lividity, despite the doctor's insistence that lividity did not present in such patterns. Wolf's family accepted the hospital's explanation, or at least did not publicly challenge it. But his brother, William, confided to several close friends that Joel had written to him after returning from Egypt. In the letter, Joel described the experience in the tomb, the sensation of being watched, the dizziness, and something else. He had been experiencing strange dreams since returning to London. Dreams of standing in a dark chamber, of golden walls pressing closer, of someone calling his name in a language he did not understand but somehow comprehended perfectly. The dreams always ended the same way, with a hand reaching out of the darkness, fingers extended, seeking his throat. The connection between Wolf's death and his visit to Tutankhamun's tomb was not immediately made by the press. Lord Carnarvon had died the previous year, in April of 1923, and while newspapers had begun to whisper about a curse, the idea had not yet solidified into the legend it would become. Wolf's death was noted in the obituaries as a tragic accident, a reminder of the fragility of life even in the age of modern medicine. But those who knew both men, who understood the connection, began to speak quietly among themselves. 2 deaths, both connected to the tomb, both involving strange circumstances that defied easy explanation. Carnarvon with his mysterious infection, and his dying words about a bird. Wolf with his bruises, and the shadows in his hospital room, and the sensation of being watched that had begun in a burial chamber beneath the Egyptian sand. The fog that had surrounded the hospital the night of Wolf's death became part of the story, part of the growing mythology. Some claimed it had been thicker than normal, more persistent, that it had clung to the building like a shroud. Others said that in the fog, if you looked carefully, you could see shapes moving, figures that seemed to drift rather than walk, silhouettes that belonged to no living person. The questions remained, documented in hospital records, in private letters, in the troubled recollections of nurses who worked that night. Why did a man recovering from routine surgery fall from his bed with such force? What created those bruising patterns, those marks that resembled grasping fingers? What were the shadows that multiple witnesses reported seeing? And why, in the days following Wolf's death, did 3 more patients on the same floor report nightmares of standing in a golden chamber, of feeling hands upon their necks, of hearing voices that spoke in languages older than memory. Joel Wolfe was buried in Highgate Cemetery on a rain-soaked afternoon. Among the mourners stood several of Carnarvon's relatives, their faces troubled, perhaps wondering if they too should regret their visits to the tomb. The priest spoke of God's mysterious ways, of the uncertainty of our mortal span. No one mentioned Egypt. No one spoke of curses or ancient kings or the price of disturbing the dead. But the silence around those subjects was itself telling, a collective decision not to name the fear that had begun to grow. The suspicion that some boundaries, once crossed, exact a toll that cannot be calculated until the payment comes due. George J. Gould stood at the entrance to the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, wiping sweat from his brow in the Egyptian heat of 1923. The American railroad executive was not accustomed to being told, "No, I'll." His family fortune, built on steel rails and steam engines that crossed continents, had opened every door in society. But Howard Carter, the archaeologist who had discovered Tutankhamun's resting place, was a different breed of man. Carter understood the value of history, not just in pounds and dollars, but in preservation and respect. According to witnesses present that day, Carter specifically warned Gould against touching anything within the tomb. The excavation was still ongoing, cataloging thousands of artifacts, and even the slightest disturbance could compromise decades of research. But Gould was not a man who responded well to restrictions. He had traveled across an ocean and a continent to see this discovery that had captivated the world's imagination, and he wanted more than just photographs and guided tours. He wanted something tangible, something he could hold in his hands, and show to friends back in New York as proof that he had been there, that he had stood where pharaohs slept. What happened next would be disputed by various accounts, but the most consistent version comes from Gould's personal secretary, Marcus Abernathy, who kept detailed journals of their Egyptian excursion. Abernathy wrote that during a moment when Carter was distracted, examining hieroglyphs on the burial chamber's western wall, Gould reached into a partially excavated side chamber and palmed something small. The movement was quick, practiced, the gesture of a man who had learned to take what he wanted when authority figures looked away. Abernathy claimed he saw a flash of blue ceramic, no larger than a man's thumb, disappear into Gould's jacket pocket. The object, as would later be described by family members who saw it in Gould's study, was a Ushabti figure. These small funerary statues, often made of faience or glazed ceramic, were placed in tombs to serve as workers for the deceased in the afterlife. They were inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, commands that would animate them when needed. The particular Ushabti that Gould allegedly took was distinctive, rendered in brilliant turquoise blue with hieroglyphs traced in gold leaf. Its face bore an unusual characteristic that several witnesses would later mention, an uncanny precision in the carving of the eyes, making them seem to follow whoever held the figure. The journey home to America was uneventful. Gould displayed the Ushabti to a few select friends during a dinner party at his estate in the Hudson Valley, holding court about his adventures in Egypt, embellishing stories of ancient curses and mysterious deaths that had already begun circulating in newspapers. He dismissed such superstitions with a laugh, telling his guests that anyone who believed in curses was a fool living in the Dark Ages. Progress and reason, he insisted, had banished such primitive fears. The little blue figure sat on his desk, a conversation piece, a trophy from a world that belonged to the past. Then came the cough. It started 3 weeks after his return, a persistent irritation that Gould attributed to the Egyptian dust still in his lungs. But the cough deepened, rattling in his chest like stones in a bucket. His wife, Edith, became concerned when the coughing fits would wake him in the night, leaving him gasping and pale in the lamplight. The family physician, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, examined him and found nothing alarming. A touch of bronchitis, perhaps, something that rest and clean American air would resolve. But the cough did not resolve. It worsened. By the 6th week, Gould developed a fever that came and went in waves, spiking high in the evenings and breaking before dawn, leaving his sheets soaked and his body trembling. Whitmore brought in specialists from Manhattan, physicians who had studied at the finest European universities. They performed examinations, listened to his lungs, drew blood, and tested for every known respiratory ailment. The diagnosis was pneumonia, but it was pneumonia that refused to respond to any treatment. Mercury compounds, herbal preparations, changes in diet and environment. Nothing made a difference. Edith Gould's letters to her sister in Boston provide chilling details of her husband's deterioration. She wrote that George would wake screaming from nightmares, thrashing in bed with such violence that she feared he would injure himself. When she tried to comfort him, he would stare past her, his eyes wide and unseeing, muttering about being watched. He spoke of golden eyes that never blinked, eyes that followed him through the dark halls of his mind. He claimed he could feel them even when he closed his own eyes, burning into him with ancient intelligence and patient malice. The servants began to whisper. Gould's valet, Thomas Brennan, reported to the house staff that his employer had become obsessed with the small blue figure on his desk. Brennan said he would enter the study to find Gould sitting in the dark, holding the ushabti in trembling hands, speaking to it in a low voice. When Brennan asked if he could be of assistance, Gould would snap at him, clutching the figure to his chest like a child protecting a toy. Other times, Brennan found Gould weeping, begging forgiveness from someone or something that wasn't there. Edith wrote that her husband began insisting he needed to return the artifact to Egypt. He became frantic about it, claiming that was the only way to make the eyes stop watching, to silence the whispers he heard in his fever dreams. He tried to make travel arrangements despite being barely able to stand without assistance. He wrote letters to Carter, letters that Edith intercepted because they were rambling and incoherent, filled with apologies and pleas for understanding. In one letter, preserved in the family archives, Gould wrote that he understood now what the ancient Egyptians knew, that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed, that some spaces between life and death should remain sealed. The pneumonia ravaged his body with frightening speed. Gould, who had been a robust man of 54 years, capable of riding horses and walking miles through his railroad yards, became a skeletal figure lost in his bedsheets. His skin took on a waxy pallor that physicians noted in their records as unusual for standard pneumonia cases. His breathing became labored, a wet rasping that echoed through the upper floors of the estate. The household staff, many of whom had served the Gould family for decades, began to avoid the hallways near his bedroom, claiming they heard voices speaking in languages they did not recognize. Dr. Whitmore's final notes, dated 4 months after Gould's return from Egypt, state that the cause of death was pneumonia complicated by respiratory failure, but he added a personal notation that was discovered years later when his papers were donated to a medical archive. In that notation, Whitmore admitted that in 30 years of practice, he had never seen a case progress so rapidly and resist treatment so completely. He wrote that Gould's death had a quality about it that defied medical explanation, as if the man's body was simply giving up, surrendering to something beyond the reach of science. George J. Gould died on the 16th of May, 1923, exactly 4 months after visiting Tutankhamun's tomb. His final words, according to the nurse who attended him in his last hours, were not addressed to his wife or children gathered around his bedside. He stared at a point in the corner of the room, his eyes tracking something no one else could see, and whispered that the eyes were satisfied now, that they would take what they were owed. The Ushabti figure vanished within days of Gould's death. Edith claimed she intended to have it returned to Egypt, to fulfill her husband's dying obsession, but when she went to his study to retrieve it, the small blue statue was gone. The desk drawers were searched, the entire study methodically examined, but the artifact had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. Brennan suggested that perhaps one of the servants had taken it, but none would admit to touching anything in the master's private room. Darker theories emerged among family members. Gould's brother, Frank, believed that someone attending the funeral had stolen it, perhaps a curious guest, or even one of the physicians who had treated George in his final days. Frank became convinced that whoever took the Ushabti would suffer the same fate, and he spent months trying to trace its whereabouts, sending inquiries to antiquities dealers and collectors throughout the Northeast. He found nothing. The little blue figure with its golden eyes had simply ceased to exist in any tangible way. Some accounts suggest that the Ushabti did resurface briefly, appearing in a private collection in Boston 2 years later, but the collector who supposedly possessed it died suddenly of lung complications before the claim could be verified. Another story places it in the hands of a museum curator in Philadelphia, who fell ill with mysterious respiratory failure and returned an unnamed Egyptian artifact to the Egyptian government before his death. But these are whispers and rumors, threads of narrative that may or may not connect to the same object that George J. Gould palmed in that tomb in the Valley of the Kings. What remains undisputed is that a healthy, wealthy, powerful man touched something he was warned not to touch, took something he was told to leave alone, and died in agony 4 months later, begging to return what he had stolen. Whether the Ushapti carried an actual curse, whether ancient priests had imbued it with protective magic, or whether Gould died of a pneumonia strain that 19th century medicine simply could not combat, we can never know with certainty. But the pattern that emerged, that those who disturbed the tomb and took from it, suffered and died, gained another data point with George J. Gould's passing. The Ushapti, wherever it rests now, remains unrecovered. Perhaps it sits forgotten in a drawer somewhere, its turquoise glaze dulled by time, its golden hieroglyphs faded. Perhaps it was destroyed, ground to dust by someone who feared its reputation. Or perhaps it waits, patient as only ancient things can be patient, for the next hand to reach out and claim it. For the next person who believes they are beyond the reach of consequences, beyond the power of warnings written in tombs, sealed for thousands of years. In the autumn of 1929, Richard Bethel was a man coming apart at the seams. Those who knew him well, those who had worked alongside him in the dusty corridors beneath the Valley of the Kings, noticed the change immediately upon his return to London. The meticulous, unflappable personal secretary to Howard Carter, the man who had catalogued every single artifact removed from Tutankhamun's tomb, had become someone else entirely. His hands trembled when he spoke. His eyes darted to corners of rooms where nothing stood. And in the exclusive gentlemen's clubs where he took his evening meals, waiters whispered that Mr. Bethel now insisted on sitting with his back to the wall. Richard Bethel had been present for it all. From the moment the seal was broken on that burial chamber in February of 1923, he had been there, notebook in hand, recording every detail with the precision of a man who understood the historical magnitude of what they had uncovered. While Carter supervised the excavation, it was Bethel who tracked each artifact, who assigned catalog numbers, who noted the precise location and condition of every object. 3,358 items in total. He had touched nearly all of them, had lifted golden collars and alabaster jars with his own bare hands, had breathed the stale air of sealed chambers that had remained undisturbed for over 3,000 years. The work was intimate in a way that few people could understand. While the world marveled at newspaper photographs and read sensational accounts in the press, Richard Bethel lived with these objects day after day, month after month, year after year. He would arrive at the makeshift laboratory before dawn, the desert air still cool, and work until long after sunset, often by lamplight, his fingers tracing hieroglyphs, his eyes studying the delicate inlay work on ceremonial furniture. He slept in a tent within yards of the tomb entrance. He took his meals surrounded by artifacts, waiting to be catalogued. The boy king's possessions became the constant backdrop of his existence. By 1928, the letters began. Richard's sister kept them all, would later show them to investigators who came asking questions. In these letters, written in the careful handwriting that had filled thousands of catalog entries, Richard Bethel described experiences he could not explain. He felt watched, he wrote, even when alone in his London apartment. At social gatherings and crowds, he sensed a presence just behind him, close enough that he could almost feel breath on the back of his neck. When he turned, there was never anyone there. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger, became impossible to ignore. The nightmares started around the same time. He described them in detail to his father, Lord Westbury, during one of their weekly dinners at the Reform Club. In these dreams, Richard found himself back in the burial chamber, but he was alone, and the air had become thick, viscous, difficult to pull into his lungs. He would try to reach the exit, but his legs wouldn't respond properly. The sensation of suffocation grew more intense, his chest burning, his vision narrowing to a small point of light. And just before he woke, gasping and drenched in sweat, he would see something moving in the darkness of the tomb. A figure approaching. Lord Westbury, a practical man of considerable means and social standing, initially dismissed these accounts as the result of overwork and the stress of the monumental task his son had undertaken. Perhaps a holiday was in order. Perhaps Richard needed to put some distance between himself and the Egyptian artifacts that had consumed his life for the better part of a decade. But as the months progressed, as Richard's condition visibly deteriorated, Lord Westbury's concern deepened into something approaching fear. His son, always so composed, so rational, had begun to seem genuinely terrified. By the autumn of 1929, Richard Bethel looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight. Friends remarked on how gaunt he had become, how the color had drained from his face. He had developed a habit of glancing over his shoulder, of pausing mid-sentence as if listening for something only he could hear. At dinner parties, he would excuse himself abruptly, claiming he felt unwell. His usual sharp wit had been replaced by a distant, haunted quality that made others uncomfortable. Some stopped inviting him to social events altogether. On the evening of November 15, 1929, Richard Bethel retired to his room at the Bath Club, one of London's most prestigious private establishments on Dover Street. He had been staying there for several weeks, preferring the club's atmosphere to his own apartment. The staff knew him well. He was polite, quiet, never any trouble. That evening, he had taken dinner in the main dining room, though witnesses later reported he had barely touched his food. He had seemed agitated, kept checking his pocket watch, and had asked the waiter twice if anyone had been looking for him. When the waiter assured him that no one had inquired after him, Richard had nodded slowly, as if this answer troubled him rather than providing relief. He went upstairs around 10 o'clock in the evening. His room was on the 3rd floor, a comfortable suite with tall windows overlooking the street below. The porter who saw him pass through the lobby noted nothing unusual about his demeanor, though he did recall that Mr. Bethel had seemed in a hurry, taking the stairs rather than waiting for the lift. The sound of his door closing echoed down the hallway. The lock turned from inside with a decisive click. What happened next has never been satisfactorily explained. At approximately 11:15 that evening, 2 separate club members reported hearing raised voices coming from Richard Bethel's room. Both men were certain they heard 2 distinct voices, engaged in what sounded like an intense argument. One witness described it as a heated disagreement, the words themselves indistinct, but the tone unmistakably confrontational. The voices rose and fell for several minutes. Then suddenly, they stopped. A heavy silence descended over the 3rd floor. The club porter, concerned by the late-night disturbance, went upstairs to investigate. He knocked on Richard Bethel's door. No answer came. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out Mr. Bethel's name. Still nothing. The silence from within the room felt wrong somehow, oppressive and complete. The porter fetched his master key, and after hesitating for just a moment, unlocked the door. Or rather, he tried to unlock it. The key turned, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside, as expected, but something felt different. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It gave way with unexpected ease. The room was exactly as it should be. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. The windows were closed and latched from the inside, the heavy curtains drawn. The temperature was normal. No smell of gas or chemicals hung in the air. And there, in the bed, lay Richard Bethel. He appeared to be sleeping peacefully, his body composed, his expression almost serene. Except he was not sleeping. He was dead. The Bath Club physician arrived within minutes. He examined the body thoroughly, looking for any sign of what might have caused the death of this 46-year-old man who had been, by all accounts, in perfect health. There were no marks of violence, no indication of poison, no signs of a heart attack or stroke. Richard Bethel's body showed no trauma whatsoever. It was as if he had simply stopped living. The physician was baffled. In all his years of practice, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The police investigation that followed turned up nothing that could explain Richard Bethel's death. The room had been locked from the inside, the windows sealed shut. Yet 2 credible witnesses insisted they had heard 2 voices arguing shortly before the body was discovered. Who had been in that room with Richard Bethel? How had they entered a locked room with sealed windows? And how had they left without a trace? The investigators had no answers. The official cause of death was listed as circulatory collapse due to unknown causes, which was really just an elaborate way of saying they had absolutely no idea what had killed him. But there was one detail that the investigators found particularly unsettling, a detail that was kept out of the official reports but circulated among those involved in the case. When Richard Bethel's body was examined more closely, the pathologist noticed something odd about the condition of his lungs. They appeared compressed, as if subjected to enormous pressure. It was the kind of damage one might see in cases of suffocation. Yet there was no indication that anything had blocked his airways or prevented him from breathing. No pillow over the face, no signs of strangulation. Just lungs that looked as if they had been crushed by an invisible force. The death of Richard Bethel sent shockwaves through the small community of Egyptologists and archaeologists who had worked on the Tutankhamun excavation. It was the latest in a series of deaths that had begun with Lord Carnarvon in April of 1923 and had continued with disturbing regularity ever since. But Richard Bethel's death was different. The locked room, the mysterious voices, the complete absence of any medical explanation. It seemed to confirm the darkest whispers about the curse, to validate the warnings that had been dismissed as superstitious nonsense. For Lord Westbury, the death of his son was devastating beyond measure. He had watched Richard deteriorate over the preceding months, had listened to his increasingly desperate accounts of feeling followed and haunted. And now his son was gone, dead under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Lord Westbury became obsessed with understanding what had happened. He read everything he could find about the tomb of Tutankhamun, about ancient Egyptian burial practices, about curses inscribed on tomb walls. He attended spiritualist seances, seeking contact with his son. He interviewed others who had worked on the excavation, looking for patterns, searching for answers that would never come. On February 20th, 1930, just 4 months after his son's death, Lord Westbury jumped from his 7th-floor apartment in St. James Court. He was 78 years old and had, until his son's death, been in good health and spirits. The note he left was brief, written in a shaking hand. It made reference to the tragedies that had befallen those associated with the tomb, to the curse that he now believed had claimed his son. The note concluded with a single sentence that investigators would later quote in hushed tones, "I cannot stand the horror any longer." The double tragedy of father and son, following so closely one upon the other, seemed to provide the final, terrible proof of the curse's reality. Here was not just coincidence, not just bad luck or natural causes. Here was a clear chain of causation running from the tomb in the Valley of the Kings to a locked room in the Bath Club to a window ledge in St. James Court. The newspapers had a field day with the story, printing increasingly sensational accounts of the curse and its victims. To this day, no one has adequately explained what happened in Richard Bethel's room on that November night in 1929. The locked door, the sealed windows, the arguing voices heard by multiple witnesses, the inexplicable death of a healthy man. All of it remains shrouded in mystery. Some suggest that Richard Bethel's paranoia and nightmares indicate a psychological breakdown, that he perhaps took his own life through some means that left no trace. But this theory fails to account for the voices, for the presence that 2 separate witnesses swore they heard arguing with him in his final moments. Others point to the physical evidence, the compressed lungs suggesting suffocation, and wonder what invisible force could have crushed the breath from his body while leaving no other mark. Richard Bethel had spent years in intimate contact with the artifacts of a long-dead pharaoh. He had handled objects meant to accompany Tutankhamun into the afterlife, objects inscribed with prayers and spells designed to protect the king through eternity. Did something follow him back from that tomb? Did some protective force, awakened by the violation of the burial chamber, track him across continents and years until it finally caught up with him in a locked room in London? Or are we simply pattern-seeking creatures, desperately trying to find meaning in tragedy, to impose narrative structure on the random cruelty of death? What we know for certain is this: Richard Bethel cataloged 3,358 items from Tutankhamun's tomb. He lived with these objects, breathed the dust of the burial chamber, spent years surrounded by the physical remnants of ancient Egypt's death rituals. And then, one November night, he died under circumstances that have never been explained, in a locked room where witnesses heard him arguing with someone who could not possibly have been there. His father, unable to bear the weight of this horror, followed him into death 4 months later. 2 more victims in a tally that continued to grow. 2 more names added to the list of those who disturbed the boy king's rest and paid the ultimate price. The question hangs in the air like incense smoke in an ancient tomb. If a curse truly stalked those who disturbed Tutankhamun's rest, why did Howard Carter, the man who broke the final seal, who first gazed upon the pharaoh's golden face, who extracted every artifact from its 3,000-year slumber, lived peacefully until 1939, dying at the unremarkable age of 64 from entirely natural causes. Carter spent 17 years meticulously cataloging the tomb's treasures, his hands touching objects that supposedly carried death in their very essence. He breathed the same air that allegedly killed Lord Carnarvon. He stood in the burial chamber longer than anyone, closer to the mummy than any living soul had been in millennia. Yet he suffered no mysterious illness, no sudden accident, no inexplicable demise. He died in his London flat, an old man with failing kidneys. His death so ordinary, it seemed almost an insult to the legend that surrounded his greatest discovery. Science has offered explanations, of course. Researchers have suggested that ancient tombs might harbor deadly fungal spores, sealed away from sunlight and oxygen for thousands of years, capable of causing severe respiratory infections in those who disturb them. The theory sounds plausible until you examine the details. Lord Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite, not lung disease. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey was shot by his wife in a London hotel. George J. Gould succumbed to pneumonia months after his visit, but he was already in poor health. The fungal spore theory cannot account for a gunshot or a mosquito bite inflicted miles from the tomb. Others have pointed to radiation, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians somehow knew how to preserve their dead using radioactive materials. But no elevated radiation has ever been detected in Tutankhamun's tomb or on any of its artifacts. The measurements are normal, unremarkable, thoroughly documented by modern equipment far more sensitive than anything available in the 1920s. The toxic mold hypothesis emerged later, proposing that aspergillus and other dangerous molds might accumulate in sealed tombs. Yet, studies of other Egyptian tombs show that, while these molds exist, they are not present in concentrations sufficient to cause immediate or even rapid death. They might cause chronic illness with prolonged exposure, but they cannot explain sudden deaths or deaths that occurred far from Egypt, sometimes years after the tomb was opened. And then, there is Richard Bethel, whose death remains the most inexplicable of all, the locked room mystery that defies every rational explanation. Bethel, Carter's trusted secretary, the man who helped catalog every item from the tomb, was found dead in his bed at the Bath Club in London on November 15, 1929. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were latched. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of poison, no marks upon his body. The official verdict was heart failure, but Bethel was only 46 years old and had been in perfect health the day before. How does a healthy man simply stop breathing in a locked room? What fungal spore follows someone from Egypt to London and waits 7 years to strike? What toxin leaves no trace, no symptom, no warning? The rational explanations crumble when confronted with the specifics of Bethel's death. It was as if something reached across continents and years to stop his heart, leaving no fingerprints in the physical world. Some have wondered if the curse was selective, if it chose its victims according to some ancient logic we cannot fathom. Did it strike at those who treated the tomb with disrespect, who saw it as merely a treasure trove rather than a sacred space? Carter was known for his reverence, his painstaking care, his genuine respect for Egyptian culture and history. He learned to read hieroglyphics. He studied the religious texts. He understood that he was not looting but preserving, not stealing but rescuing from oblivion. Perhaps, some whisper, his reverence protected him. Perhaps whatever spirit or force dwelt in that tomb recognized the difference between grave robber and archaeologist, between desecration and devotion. It sounds like superstition until you remember that Carter was the one constant, the one person present for every moment of the tomb's opening who lived a full and natural life. But there is something else, something discovered only with modern forensic techniques that cast the entire mystery in a darker light. When scientists finally examined Tutankhamun's mummy using advanced imaging technology, they found evidence that the young pharaoh did not die peacefully. His body showed signs of violence. A broken leg, possible damage to the skull, fractures inconsistent with the mummification process or the passage of time. The boy king who took the throne at 9 and died at 18 may have been murdered. Ancient texts, fragments of records from his time, hint at political intrigue. at a vulnerable youth controlled by ambitious advisors. His death came suddenly, suspiciously, at the very moment he was beginning to assert his own authority. If he was murdered, if his life was stolen by those he trusted, might his spirit indeed be restless? Might a soul denied justice in life seek it in death? The story does not end in the 1930s. Walk through the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, or the British Museum in London, and you will find staff who refuse to work alone with Tutankhamun artifacts after dark. This is not legend. This is not exaggeration. Museum workers today, educated professionals in the 21st century, will tell you quietly that something feels wrong when you are alone with those objects at night. Some describe a heaviness in the air. Others report feeling watched. A few have requested transfers rather than continue working in those galleries. The question that haunts us, the one that cannot be answered with science or statistics, is this: how many more deaths went unrecorded, dismissed as mere coincidence? We know of the famous victims, the ones connected directly and publicly to the tomb. But how many workers, how many Egyptian laborers, how many minor officials and assistants died in the years following the discovery? Their names were not recorded in newspapers. Their deaths did not make headlines. They were locals, expendable in the eyes of history, their passing noted only by grieving families who had no voice to declare that something was wrong. The Curse of Tutankhamun remains unsolved, not because we lack theories, but because the theories we have cannot contain the full strangeness of what occurred. Science explains individual deaths, but not the pattern. Coincidence explains some deaths, but not their timing. And nothing, no rational framework we possess, can explain why the one man who should have been cursed above all others lived longest and died most peacefully, unless something in that tomb was indeed watching, judging, choosing who would live and who would die. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.